This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Tech News Today is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Tech News Today, recorded on September 21st for December 24th, 2015. This episode is brought to you by FreshBooks, the super simple cloud accounting software that's giving thousands of freelancers and small businesses the tools to save time billing and get paid faster. Try it free at freshbooks.com/TNT.
Tech News Today is the show where we talk about the tech news with the journalists who report it. Welcome to the show. I'm Mike Elgan.
And I'm Megan Morrone. For our special holiday episodes, we'll be looking at some of the biggest and most controversial stories of the year.
Joining us today is John Markoff, best-selling author and Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter. Markoff wrote Takedown about the hunt for super hacker Kevin Mitnick, What the Dormouse Said, How the 60s Counterculture Shaped the Personal Computer Industry, and other books. Today, we're talking to John about his new book, Machines of Loving Grace, the quest for common ground between humans and robots. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Hi.
Thank you so much for coming on. Really excited about this. Now, this is an extremely ambitious book. Can you tell us, first of all, where the title Machines of Loving Grace came from?
Oh, yeah. That's actually an easier thing to do. Richard Brautigan was a poet, and I'm one of those people who grew up in the 60s who read Brautigan in college, trout fishing in America and Confederate General in Big Sur. And I have to confess, I didn't run across All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace until the 80s when I was sort of involved in personal computing. But it was always a poem which I was fond of. And then I didn't come up with the title. I simply had the poem in the flyleaf of my book. And my editor, Hillary Redmond at HarperCollins, saw it, and she said, that's obviously the title. And she was right.
It's a great title. Now, there's a big divide in the field of robotics between artificial intelligence, or AI, and intelligence augmentation, or IA. Can you explain the difference between the two and some of the ways that's played out over the years in robotics?
Sure. AI in the 1960s was really the heart and soul of computer science. John McCarthy coined the term AI in the 1950s, and he created a laboratory right next to Stanford University in 1962. At that time, he thought it would take a decade to build a thinking machine to replace a human. And on the other side of campus, around the same time, another laboratory called the Augmentation Research Center was created by Doug Engelbart, who you probably know because he invented the computer mouse and he invented hypertext, which became the basis for the World Wide Web. He started a research center basically to explore designing technologies that would amplify human intelligence, make it possible for small groups of workers, intellectual workers, to cooperate and collaborate. And I looked at those two laboratories and I realized that they had a sort of a philosophical different approach to the world. And in fact, in the intervening 4 or 5 decades, those two communities in computer science, the AI community on one side and what's now called the HCI community, human computer interaction, they basically had a very fundamentally different approach to computing, and they, by and large, don't talk to each other. And that was what the sort of the circle that I was trying to square in writing the book.
I love the way that you frame the book around that idea because it's a very philosophical idea. I mean, technologically, there's a lot of potential or theoretical crossover, and even theoretically there is as well. For example, if you're using something like Siri, Siri is a human augmenter on the one hand, but it's replacing a human assistant on the other. So it's kind of both. Yet this philosophical divide is very profound, especially culturally, because the two, as you point out in your book and illustrate many times, don't really talk to each other, don't particularly like each other, don't agree with each other. And there's a big philosophical divide about what computers can do for us. And I think that's really interesting. Now, before we get into that, you mentioned at the beginning of your book a project from the 60s, or I'm sorry, from the early aughts called Calo, which was a Pentagon-funded initiative. Aren't they all Pentagon-funded? And at the end of the book, or near the end, you talk about Adam Chair, I think you pronounce it, and Siri. Can you talk about the connection between Calo and Siri?
Yeah, so Calo's an interesting project started by a DARPA director whose name was Tony Tether, who was a very controversial DARPA director. He's also associated with the the DARPA self-driving vehicle project, and total information awareness, John Poindexter's project that ended up getting canceled by Congress and then getting discovered years later by Edward Snowden, but that's another story, so we won't get into that. But Tether really wanted to create an AI assistant for, an admiral or a captain or, somebody in the military that would do, I guess the simplest way to describe it, if people remember, and maybe they don't actually, there was once upon a time a Apple Vision video called Knowledge Navigator. And the Calo project really was an effort to build a real-world knowledge navigator, and pretty much Siri grew directly out of it. Adam Char was one of the architects, and Tom Gruber was another, and they were both actually directly inspired by Knowledge Navigator, which was this video that John Scully commissioned Alan Kay to sort of gin up in the 1980s when he needed an idea to sort of drive Apple forward after Steve Jobs had left. And they had this notion of an assistant for an absent-minded university professor. And that really captured Adam Char's imagination very early on. And he and Tom Gruber have been working on that idea ever since.
Well, the assistant part is fascinating because it's that, that's the augmentation, right? That's the intelligence augmentation, is instead of doing everything for us, just helping us along. And I am wondering, you talk a little bit about how technology has already made us a little less good at basic survival skills like GPS. Is that a risk that instead of this like giant Terminator risk, is that the risk that we're talking about, just making us less smart?
Well, so that's a sort of mega internet question. Is the internet dumbing us down, or is it creating a whole new class of Aristotles? And I think probably both things are going on. It's very hard for me to sort of grapple with that dumbing down idea. It happens in subtle ways. I don't see it happening in the kind of navigation way where you lose a part of your brain. I see it as the danger of the lack of focus right now because of the way the internet as a media has evolved. I'm so impressed that you actually listened to or read my book, because everything is sort of broken down into bite-sized chunks, right? And I worry mostly about intelligence being an artifact of being able to focus on things for extended periods of time, and the modern internet is a distraction engine. I think that's probably the biggest threat to human intelligence right now in some ways. So it both gives in the sense of things like Google search, and it takes away in the sense of immense distraction.
Oh, I definitely agree. It is harder. I was an English major. I used to read 13, 14 novels a year. It's very difficult. It's just definitely harder to read at this point because of how much, time on the screen that we spend. And
you're reading all the time. That's the rich irony. You just don't read long form stuff as much.
Mm-hmm.
And the internet, of course, is always calling. Now, my fear for the future is that people will prefer the company of AI and the future of Siri and so on. Also prefer the worlds of virtual reality. And your book didn't help at all. You talked to, and of course, you also wrote an article for the New York Times, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, about Xiaoice, which is a Microsoft project happening in China that astonished everyone, including Microsoft. And in your book, though, you talk about a book called The Media Equation, which I hadn't heard of before, by Clifford Nass and Byron Reeves. Can you talk about that whole area of people treating computers and machines as if they're human beings?
Yeah. Going all the way back to the beginning of modern personal computing, there was a company called Infocom in Boston that did text adventure games. I don't know if you date yourself that far, but their slogan was, "The best graphics are in your mind." And they did text games. Everything. It was like reading a novel. You had to imagine it. And I really, that phrase stuck with me until about the PS3 or a certain version of the Xbox. I realized that there were things that were being created by computer animators, which were things I could never imagine, and they'd sort of crossed over. It wasn't the uncanny valley, but all of a sudden that world was richer than my imagination for the first time. And I'm a regular science fiction reader, and I'm saying that to sort of get to your point, because you started before we came on the air by saying, well, you're worried about the gamers disappearing into these virtual worlds, and they're very compelling. And I think I actually agree with you that is one risk, that we will be increasingly isolated from one another by these proxies for human interaction. As they become more compelling worlds, people will find less and less time to interact directly face to face. I mean, I think that's the scenario that I think about a lot. And I believe, for example, in writing about conversational agents, and I think that's what's emerging today. Siri is an example, Cortana is an example, Google Now. That conversational technology is going to evolve very quickly. Disembodied robotics, I think, are more real, and that model of the world that's sketched by her is not very far from science fiction. I mean, the problem is the bar is so low. We as a species have a predilection for anthropomorphizing just about everything. Our dogs, our cars, and we'll be quite comfortable talking to machines that are wonderful conversationalists, and that will happen. I mean, you mentioned the Zhao Ice project in China, which right now is just chat. You have to type to it. But what made it more compelling than other chatbots is really quite intriguing to me, what Microsoft did. They were able to use, next generation computing technology, big data types approaches to basically strip mine the Chinese social web for all of the question and answer pairs. And so they have this immense encyclopedic library of conversation. And any question or statement that somebody makes to the machine, they have a compelling answer because somebody's already had that interaction. And it makes the interaction with Zhao Ice, I think, more believable than traditional chatbots have. And Microsoft is pushing ahead, and they're gonna make it speech. So it will actually speak to you the way Siri does. And Microsoft went in a very different direction than the designers of Cortana and Siri did. I mean, those are productivity tools. The idea is to ask a question, get your answer, or get your action, and go on with your day-to-day work. Zhao Ice is an entertainment device in some ways, and I think what I said in my article is that the Microsoft designers were uncomfortable about it because people have this deep. These lengthy conversations, and 25% of the people who use Zhao Ice have typed "I love you" to the program, and no way of telling whether they're doing it seriously or whether they're doing it as we all goof around with Siri and do that kind of stuff. But clearly something interesting is taking place, a giant social experiment. I spoke to an IBM researcher who's Chinese, and she had a different perspective than the Americans that I spoke to, like Sherry Turkell. She felt that when Chinese come to America, they feel like our society, she said, is quiet. We don't have as much social interaction as the Chinese do. And her sense of Zhao Ice was that it created a private space where people could be alone with their thoughts. And so that's kind of a hopeful interpretation of that interaction. But I'm very aware if the net of this sort of wave of technology is isolating us all, more than we were isolated before. I mean, that started to happen with television, except the family sat in the living room together. And then with the emergence of interactive games, we were in some ways pulled more apart. And yet gaming is not entirely virtual. It is a social, people who defend it would call it a social action because there are other human gamers. I guess I feel like you. It's difficult to pick apart, and there are some paths that we could go down as a society that would be deeply troubling.
You talked about the cultural differences in China that would lend somebody to find something like Zhao Ice really compelling. There's also a phenomenon like that in Japan. I read somewhere, I think it was also the New York Times, that people are having funerals for their Aibo robots because, of course, the batteries are dying. They're sort of experiencing a mass end of life there for that product that was discontinued years ago. And this whole phenomenon is why I personally don't think that the Turing test is as important as we thought it was. The Turing test, of course, is designed to find out if a machine can trick you into believing, not being able to tell if it's a human or a machine, even if you're truly trying to tell, because of the phenomenon you talked about. It's human nature to want to anthropomorphize our machines, and we'll meet them halfway. And I already find myself I use all the virtual assistants, but the one that seems most human to me, oddly enough, is the least sophisticated, which is Alexa, because Alexa is in the kitchen with us. It's not something in the phone where now I'm using an app or something like that. It's just we talk and she talks back. And psychologically, it seems kind of like more of a human. I know it's not, obviously. The Japanese owners of Aibo robots know they're not real dogs. But I think the dog metaphor and the dog robot idea is an interesting one, because I do think that virtual assistants will be more like dogs than they will be substitute people. They'll be like substitute pets, in the sense that the reason people like dogs is they don't judge you. They're always looking out for you. They're always happy to see you. All those characteristics that we don't find in other humans. And this is one of the reasons why people love dogs so much. And I think people will actually love their virtual assistants of the very near future. I think it'll happen very, very soon.
Yeah.
So,
let me try a theory out on you guys that tell me if this makes any sense. I believe, we make fun of the Japanese for their obsession with robots, but I actually believe our society is every bit as obsessed with machines, intelligent machines, as the Japanese. It's just that we have a love-hate relationship with them. We're schizophrenic. We have, sort of Terminator fears, and then we have her-like romances. But that our society is just every bit as obsessed with these machines as the Japanese.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about self-driving cars and other interesting technologies. We'll be right back after this.
This episode of Tech News Today is brought to you by FreshBooks. If you're a freelancer or you run a small business, chances are your least favorite part is rummaging through receipts trying to keep track of your expenses. FreshBooks is the super simple cloud accounting software that's giving thousands of businesses just like yours the tools to save time billing and get paid faster. Getting started on FreshBooks could not be easier, even if you're not a numbers person. You'll be creating and sending invoices in just a few minutes. You get paid upfront. Now you can request a deposit in FreshBooks. No more covering costs out of pocket or waiting until the end of a project to get paid. FreshBooks lets you organize your expenses easily. You can track your time almost instantly. Of course, just use your mobile device. Plus, FreshBooks just announced their new card reader. Now you can easily accept credit cards wherever businesses take you, quickly and securely, right from your iPhone in less than a minute. FreshBooks card reader is EMV chip card enabled, the new standard in the U.S. It works right out of the box. Just open your invoice from the FreshBooks app, plug it into the reader, and dip the chip or swipe the stripe. You'll wonder why you didn't start with FreshBooks sooner. Getting started is simple, and it's totally free for 30 days. Go to freshbooks.com/TNT, and don't forget to enter Tech News Today in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Start your 30-day free trial today, and we thank FreshBooks for supporting this episode of Tech News Today. So before I read your book, John, I thought that self-driving cars could not come soon enough for me. I don't like driving. I think people are terrible drivers. They're unpredictable. They're distracted. But there are so many complicated problems that you bring up about autonomous vehicles. Let's start with one, the four-way stop problem, which is just this, as you call it, social ballet of like, I'll go first. No, you go first. And how are they ever going to make an algorithm that can figure that out?
Yeah, I actually think that one is something that, you could probably mimic our behavior. You could write an algorithm that would do that. That's possible. But there are many, many, many other edge cases that are going to be deeply challenging for, turning cars loose, completely loose in the wild. There are all kinds of issues. For example, our roads in America are much more dynamic than people realize. I mean, they've changed constantly, up to and including entire bridges move. And all that has to be sort of real-time information for not just a dozen Google cars in a trial fleet, but in tens of thousands of cars in urban areas. And for example, no one's really thought, apparently, clearly about the bandwidth issues in turning loose tens of thousands of self-driving cars. But there are other problems too. For example, being able to recognize that a human figure is actually a police officer, and then being able to interpret their hand signals is something that the cars are going to have to be able to do. Or if the police officer speaks to you, the car is going to have to understand the police officer. Then there's the liability issue related to what philosophers like to call the trolley problem. Programmers are going to have to build ethical decision-making into these capabilities, into these systems. Do you want to run over the 10 people who are right in front of you, or if you swerve left, you're going to kill 2? Those kinds of problems, I think, have not been addressed by the designers of these systems. And, I'm willing to bet that 10 years out, there will not be commercial trucks without human operators on the Nevada or California freeways. That's simple. That said, Google has shifted they've sort of expanded their self-driving car project, and they have these low-speed vehicles that are rubberized, so if they hit something, they won't kill them. They're limited to 25 miles an hour. They have no steering wheel, no brake, no accelerator. They just have a screen so that Google can advertise you while you're being driven around. And in urban areas or on campuses or in assisted living facilities, I think that actually might be a realistic, model. And maybe that's what Uber has in mind. The average speed in San Francisco, I think, for vehicles is 18 miles an hour. So a car that's limited to 25 miles an hour would work just fine. Google's project has been extraordinarily impressive. I think they're over 1 million miles without a computer-caused accident. I think they've had 14 accidents or incidents, largely caused by humans. But in April, they basically said, hey, we've stumbled across this problem. We began giving these cars to our employees to commute with. And at the end of the day, we found their behavior was distracted up to and including falling asleep. And that's called the handoff problem. And if you're asleep or you're playing World of Warcraft and the computer says, I give up, you take control, it's just not going to work ever.
Yeah.
Right. If you don't think you're driving, you're not going to be in that mindset. It's the same problem we have right now when we suddenly start, talking to Siri on our phone or any kind of thing we do that's distracting us.
Yeah. That's why I thought what Toyota did 2 weeks ago by investing in a research project at MIT and Stanford, $50 million in the AI labs at both universities, designed to build intelligent as opposed to self-driving cars. And they have sort of articulated this other vision, which is a pure IA vision, if you think about it. What they want to do is design a guardian angel or a driver's ed teacher to be always sitting on your shoulder. You're responsible, you're driving. But if you do something stupid, the car will step in and do the right thing. And that itself is a hard problem, but it may be more solvable than taking you out of the loop entirely.
I love to see people freaking out about the trolley problem, and I think that to a certain extent that already exists. I mean, people buy an SUV, which is a heavy, big sort of tank-type vehicle that doesn't maneuver particularly well, precisely because they're willing to sacrifice whoever's outside of the car for the people who are inside. And the cars are sold. Nobody comes out and says it, but everybody knows that that's why they're selling these cars to families who don't need to do four-wheel drive or so on. So, I wonder if they actually advertise cars with algorithms that will sacrifice external humans for the sake of the internal ones. But let's shift gears to the whole question of labor. I'm fascinated by this, and you really highlighted this and made it very crystal clear in your book about the fact that nobody agrees on whether the coming wave of artificial intelligence is going to employ us all with these amazing jobs. Nobody's going to have drudgery. We're all going to be philosophers, and or they're going to wipe out all jobs, and nobody's going to have a job, and then the whole economy will crater because there's no economic activity. Why can't anybody agree on this point, and why can't we tell whether having these intelligent machines is going to make or break the human labor markets?
Yeah, I have to confess to you, as I've gotten more into this and I've read more and more, it gets murkier and murkier. I was reading today, I found myself reading The Economist, the labor economists, about this particular issue, which was called workforce or labor polarization. And there's not even a consensus about this notion of whether our society has been hollowed out. there is a strong perspective that sort of the economy is growing at the top and the bottom and not in the middle. And there is an assertion that that's about technology and the deployment of technology, but the economists are even debating that. And so I started out, I have to confess, in the hair on fire camp. I did some of the early reporting in 2010 about the new wave of AI technology, and I could see evidence that they were having impact on the legal profession. $35 an hour paralegals and $400 an hour attorneys were being displaced by programs called e-discovery software that could do a demonstrably better job of reading legal documents than humans. And the implications, of course, is that AI technology is going to begin to transform the top of the workforce as much as the sort of the manual part of the workforce. And the more I got into it, the more I discovered is that you've got what I referred to in the book is you have the International Federation of Robotics on one side that argues that robots are going to create a job renaissance. And you have a set of computer scientists on the other side, people like Moshe Vardi and people at Google who believe that machines will be able to do everything that humans can do by 2045 or thereabouts. And I sort of 2 points. I believe that that's increasingly just not not increasingly, that is not the case. It is going to be more difficult for computers to take away human jobs that revolve flexibility. Things that are repetitive can be automated, but not even that's even a complex question. Let's look at a job that can be very easily automated today, the job of the human barista, and try to imagine Starbucks without any people. I submit that that there's a reason you have humans in that coffee-making loop that's intangible and is not simply an issue of cost and productivity. And, bank tellers are another great example of that. ATMs do the job fine, and yet as telecommunications costs have plummeted and computing costs have plummeted, branch banking has exploded in our society, and there are as many banks on every corner in a big city as there are Starbucks and Pete's. And the banks, it turns out, want to have a human facing their customers. And that's not a simple issue of being able to formally, eliminate that job. It's a more complex question. And then finally, the advanced industrial world is aging more quickly than people realize. And this was sort of what woke me up to this. I was sort of making the argument to Danny Kahneman, the economist, that when robots came to China, social disruption would follow. And he said to me, "You don't get it. In China, the robots are going to come just in time." And I said, "Excuse me? What do you mean?" And he pointed out to me that they had the one-child policy, and they're going to have this contracting workforce at a certain point on one side. So the labor force will shrink. It's absolutely collapsing in Japan. And then you're going to have an aging population. And so you might actually, the whole notion of being able to care for people, aging people with robots so that they can be independent longer is actually a really interesting possibility. Not technically possible yet, but perhaps within our lifespans, it just might be. And so I really sort of, I'm so skeptical about even, so the other popular debate that's going on now is about growing sort of wage inequality and wealth inequality in society. And what's the role of technology in that? Clearly, it plays some role, but it may be that tax policy may be a more important factor than technology. It's yet to be proven, as far as I'm concerned.
The economic argument is definitely a very complicated one. I mean, you take there's so many different jobs we're talking about, like the caring for the aged, like that's a job that's not dangerous, but it's a job that's maybe people don't really want to have. But then you have certainly dangerous jobs, like take the factory workers in Foxconn, and you talk a lot about the lights out factory, the factory where there are no longer people. So what happens to those people who worked at Foxconn, arguably a horrible job to begin with, but a job? Does the economic argument follow that those people might not have jobs, but they might have cheaper cell phones, be able to buy cell phones, and then get a better job?
Yeah, so, The social policy questions that this has raised, first let me say I don't have answers. I've read the literature, I've seen the discussion. One solution is a basic income, and I think that for political reasons in the United States today, that's very unlikely. I'm more interested as we move from a society in which people tended to have a single job for their entire career to this gig economy where people are changing jobs at 3 to 5 year intervals. Maybe it would make sense for society to provide education or provide support for people who want to be educated or re-educated on a regular basis. I mean, we've done that experiment as a society before. The GI Bill was tried in the wake of World War II, and it maybe that's not a socialist idea at all. Maybe that's just providing raw material for the new form of capitalism, and it would give people the opportunity to move from job to job more fluidly. Maybe the new model is to get a liberal arts education so you have the ability to think, and then as you need to, retrain yourself to do something new over and over again. And I don't know what I think of that society. I'm not sure that would be a comfortable society to live in if you have to sort of retool yourself every 3 or 4 years. But I think that if that is true, that might be the way society should respond and basically deal with those technological changes.
I certainly agree with that as well. Now, there's a lot of anxiety about what the future is going to deliver to us. Everyone from Elon Musk to Bill Gates is claiming that the AI machines are going to be scary. I think Steve Wozniak is repeating the quote, I don't know who originally said it, that robots will keep us as pets. I think people fear the singularity, all that kind of thing. But is anybody out there arguing that AI is going to save us? And I'll give you 2 ways in which this could be possible. You mentioned the aging population problem. The reason people have lots of kids in a lot of countries is because they want human beings to take care of them in their older years. And as economies evolve a little bit, people choose to have 2 kids instead of 12 because they become more of a burden than a benefit. You can imagine a number that would be a good number of humans to have on the planet. It's not going to be 7 billion. It's not going to be 15 billion. It's probably somewhere south of 3 or 4 billion. Right? I mean, what our planet needs is for there to be less of us, I think, and for us to actually evolve to the point where we can have fewer people on the planet. We're going to need to have this situation where almost everybody's over the age of 60, except for some small minority for a while, and robots and intelligent machines can help us do that, as you mentioned. But the other one is that people are afraid that artificial intelligence robots are going to be these inhuman sort of virtual creatures with no human values. But I'm not sure I'm not sure humans have done a very good job of running things, frankly. I mean, in the same way that I think it's clear that computers are going to be better drivers than human drivers are, maybe they'll be better at running everything than humans are.
Yeah, so look at what IBM is trying to do with Watson. And it's still emerging, and it's a lot of it's, I think at this point, still public relations. But I think you could see a version of Watson that moves in the direction that you're suggesting, where we might be helped with all kinds of social planning and economic decision making by machines that would have, they'd be programmed with values. I'm not one at all who subscribes to the unofficial religion of Silicon Valley, which is the singularity. I see a lot of evidence that things are slowing down rather than speeding up right now. And I don't expect or see any evidence of self-aware machines. I do, however, think that machines will be increasingly autonomous in making decisions. And of course, they'll be making decisions based on human values that have been placed there by the people who program them. And that's a tremendous responsibility that the designers have, which is sort of what I spent my time trying to find my way toward is, a new design ethics for these new machines is what we need. We need to design them in a thoughtful manner so that they will make decisions that support, the kinds of societies we want to live in the future.
I definitely felt like that was one of the most fascinating parts of your book. I mean, you hear a lot. I have kids in school. They're just like, robotics. We're going to teach coding. And that's great and amazing. And I love it. But I fear that it's in place of reading novels, which teach people empathy and, just learning about history and the rest, just being able to be equally cognizant of, science and humanities. It's, I think, definitely something that I hope everyone is striving for.
Ria, we've probably raised a lot of disturbing questions and fears and so on, and of course I think that's totally rational. But can you give us a hint of optimism? I know you are an optimist, and I don't think you're a blind utopianist by any stretch of the imagination, but I think you believe in humans will figure it out, I think, to a certain extent, if that's fair. Can you give us an optimistic view of the future based on your research in the book? What's a likely good scenario going forward into this strange new future?
Well, yeah, and being a reporter, the best thing about being a reporter is you don't have to be a visionary. You can just jot down what everybody else says, and you don't risk being wrong. So you're forcing me into an uncomfortable position. But I've seen recent inventions. I mean, for example, let's take the path from Terry Winogrand, who began as one of the pioneering AI researchers, and then famously in the 1980s walked away from the field, gave up on AI, and set himself to focusing on humans-computer interaction. He really sort of wanted to focus on designing from the human out. And one of the real huge positive impacts he had on the world that is, I think, undersung is he convinced Larry Page for his doctoral dissertation not to focus on self-driving cars and not to focus on moonshots, but to focus on Google search. And, I think Google search is a model for this kind of tool that we might have as humans, all the world's information at our fingertips, organized by these machines of love and grace, if you will, Google data centers, perhaps. I mean, I think that's a real human trajectory. I mean, Terry had an impact on the world in convincing one of the designers of Google to build that kind of a system that augments human intelligence rather than replaces it. And if we had 30 or 40 more examples like this, I think it would be a tremendous thing.
And I agree with that completely. And I think as we go forward, we'll find that, as we've always found, that humans are a lot harder to replace than we thought. And so I hope that continues, at least in my lifetime, the lifetime of my children, at the very least. John Markoff writes at nytimes.com. You can find his book at harpercollins.com. Just search for Machines of Loving Grace. And after you make that search, if you click on John Markoff's name, you'll get a link to all of his book tour type activity, right? So you can find a meetup where John is talking about his book and on that harpercollins.com website. John Markoff, thank you so much for joining us on Tech News Today.
Thanks, you guys. That was fun. I appreciate your time.
Take care. You can subscribe to Tech News Today at twit.tv/TNT. You can also watch us live every weekday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1700 UTC at twit.tv/live. And if you're ever in the San Francisco Bay Area, come in and watch us as part of our studio audience. It is free. Just send emails to tickets@twit.tv and follow us on Twitter at Tech News Today TV.
And that is the Tech News Today. This show is produced by Jason Cleanthes. We're Mike Elgan and Megan Morrone. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.